The bioscanner returned a neural coherence index of 0.17, which was either a sensor fault or the worst reading Sabin had logged in 11 years of quarantine medicine. She tapped the unit twice, old habit, meaningless, and ran the diagnostic. The diagnostic agreed with itself. 0.17. She was still looking at the number when the docking alarm went off. The Scifi transport was a cluster vessel, organically modular, the kind that expanded and contracted as its crew mind required. It sealed against airlock 4 with the particular soft precision of a species that had been doing biological docking for 600 years before humanity figured out the wheel. Sabin pulled up the manifest on her tablet and found nothing. No cargo declaration, no medical transfer forms, no custodian documentation. The transport had filed a docking request 40 minutes ago and listed its purpose as routine resupply, which was a category that required zero paperwork and which the station AI had approved automatically. She was already moving down the corridor when the airlock cycled. What they left was a metabolic stabilization pod, Scifi manufacture, third generation, the kind used for long-haul juvenile transport. Matte gray, sealed, about the size of a large packing crate. It sat on the deck plate just inside the airlock threshold, and the transport was already retracting its docking collar before Sabin reached the window. She hailed them 3 times. The transport did not respond. By the time she got clearance to access the external comm array, it was outside the station's range and climbing toward the transit corridor. The pod's status light was amber. Sabin stood there for a moment that she would not later be able to account for, and then she pulled out her tablet and called the Scifi embassy on the station's upper ring. The duty officer answered in 6 seconds, which was fast enough that she suspected they had been watching the docking feed. She asked about the pod. The duty officer's translator rendered its response in standard with the characteristic flatness of Scifi vocalization, which conveyed neither embarrassment nor regret, because those were not categories that mapped cleanly onto cluster cognition. It told her that the pod contained a juvenile female of the Scifi, designation Veth of no cluster, and that a biological severance notice had been filed with the compact registry at 400 that morning. The juvenile's kin cluster had formally excised her from their collective index. She was not, the duty officer clarified, a Scifi national. She was not, under current compact treaty frameworks, anything with a legal category. Sabin asked if the embassy intended to provide medical documentation. The duty officer said the embassy considered the matter closed. The call ended. The pod's status light was still amber. Amber in Scifi metabolic coding meant distress. Not critical, not yet, but the trajectory of amber without intervention was a direction Sabin had seen enough times to know where it went. This was not her jurisdiction. The pod was not registered to the station. There was no transfer of custody, no medical authorization, no billing code under which she could open that pod and treat whatever was inside it without generating a chain of paperwork that would tie her to a legal situation the station's administration would not thank her for. She opened the pod. The override was a physical lever, not electronic. Biological pods used mechanical failsafes because electronics failed and biology did not wait. She pulled it. The seal disengaged with a soft exhalation of temperature-regulated atmosphere, and the interior was revealed in the pod's amber running lights. The juvenile was approximately 60 centimeters, contracted. Scifi juveniles could compress their radial bodies significantly under stress. Her chromatophore layer was dark except for 11 discrete nodes distributed across her dorsal surface, each pulsing at irregular intervals in the deep violet that Sabin's training identified as distress frequency emission. The Scifi were bioluminescent in the way that deep-sea organisms were bioluminescent, not decorative, not incidental. The light was cognition made visible. You were watching a mind when you watched the light. 11 nodes. The reference range for a juvenile, her estimated age was 23 to 27, firing in synchronized clusters. Sabin put her bare hand on the pod's outer rim, not touching the juvenile, just present at the threshold, and looked at the 11 lights blinking in no pattern she could identify. One of them pulsed once, hard, and went still. She noted the time. She noted the reading. She began her intake assessment, because that was what you did, and the doing of it was the only framework she had that was currently functional. By hour 14, Sabin had administered 3 rounds of xenopediatric stabilization according to the Scifi juvenile protocol, and all 3 had done approximately nothing. Veth, she had started using the name, which was not standard practice for an organism with no legal status, and she had noted this in her own thinking without stopping, had not declined further. She had also not improved. The 11 nodes continued their arrhythmic pulsing. The 12th node, which had gone dark in the pod, remained dark. The stabilization protocol assumed a juvenile whose ganglia were desynchronized by trauma or environmental stress. It delivered targeted neurostimulants designed to encourage the nodes toward coherence. Veth's nodes received these stimulants and did not cohere. They also did not reject the treatment in the way that contraindicated medication behaved. They simply continued doing what they had been doing, indifferent to the pharmaceutical argument. Sabin pulled the Scifi medical database at hour 17, which required embassy credentials she technically held as a compact quarantine officer, and which the embassy had not yet thought to revoke. She found Veth's cluster designation. Veth had been excised from the record, but the medical history was still accessible, flagged as archived. She read it twice because the first time she thought she had misunderstood the translator. She had not misunderstood. Veth's condition was congenital. The desynchronization was not caused by the pod transit or the abandonment or any environmental factor. She had been born with 11 functional ganglionic nodes when her cluster siblings had between 23 and 29. A Scifi cluster was a cognitive collective. Its members shared processing across synchronized nodes, the individual's intelligence a function of network participation. A juvenile with 11 nodes could not interface with the cluster's bandwidth. She could not contribute to the shared cognition that was, for Scifi, the basic unit of thought. She was not dying from neglect. She had been abandoned because she would not be integrated. Not a sick cluster member, an island in a species that ran on confluence. The cluster had carried her for 8 years, which was longer than Scifi law required, and had then filed the paperwork and departed. Sabin sat with this information for a period she did not time. Then she pulled up the next diagnostic and kept working. She told herself this was protocol. There was a biological entity in her medical base showing distress readings, and abandoning an entity in distress was not something she did. This was true. It was also not the entirety of what was happening, and she was aware, in the way that a person can be aware of their own confabulation in real time and still not interrupt it, that the rational action had been defined, logged, and declined approximately 6 hours ago. The rational action had been to contact the station administration, document the pod arrival, and wait for a legal determination. She had not done this. She had opened the pod instead, and the opening was prior to any explicit decision she could identify. The amygdala, her neuroscience elective had taught her, generates the response before the cortex generates the explanation. The cortex calls the explanation a reason. This was one of those times. She ran a third scan, 11 nodes, the 12th still dark. The arrhythmic pulsing continued at a frequency that the database classified as non-communicative distress emission, which meant the light was not signaling anything to anyone. It was just what an isolated Scifi nervous system did when it was not in contact with its cluster. Sabin mapped the node positions manually onto a light board, because the scanner's automated overlay was built for healthy range coherence indices and kept trying to correct Veth's readings toward a norm that did not apply. She plotted 11 points. She drew the pulse intervals on a separate timeline. She looked at it for a long time. The pulses were not random. They were not regular, but they were not the chaos of system failure either. There was something, not a pattern, not quite, but a tendency. A shape that kept almost repeating and then shifting and then almost repeating again in the new configuration. She labeled the graph. She saved it. She did not know yet what she had saved. Hour 31. Veth's 11 nodes had a measurable period, 4.3 seconds between the most consistent pulse pair, varying by no more than 0.2 seconds across the last 4 hours. That was not arrhythmia. Arrhythmia did not have a period. Arrhythmia did not vary within a bounded range. Whatever Veth's nervous system was doing, it was doing it with a consistency that had structure. Sabin had spent the intervening hours reading everything the compact xenobiological database had on Scifi ganglionic architecture, which was considerable and almost entirely useless for her current situation, because it was entirely indexed to cluster-normal physiology. Scifi, who were not part of clusters, did not appear in the literature except as pathology. Veth was not a research subject. She was a diagnostic error in the existing framework. The photostimulation array in the medical bay was designed for human phototherapy and had a secondary mode for bioluminescent species environmental support. Sabin had used it twice before, both times for adult Scifi crew members experiencing cluster separation stress during long transits. The protocol was to match the array's output to the cluster's documented emission frequency and provide a synthetic approximation of the collective signal. Veth had no cluster frequency on record. Her cluster's frequency had been de-indexed along with everything else. Sabin set the array to echo mode instead, not a fixed frequency. A listener. The array would read Veth's emission pattern and reproduce it back at a 3-second lag with a slight amplitude increase, not correction, not normalization. Just, here is what you are putting out, returned to you, amplified. She ran the calibration. She activated the array. For 40 seconds, nothing changed. Then one of Veth's 11 nodes shifted frequency, not toward the Scifi reference range, not toward anything Sabin could classify, just away from where it had been, and 2 of the adjacent nodes shifted with it. Not synchronized. Not the cluster coherence the database treated as the target state, but responsive. The system had noticed the feedback and adjusted. Sabin watched this and understood that her hypothesis was wrong. She had thought she was providing therapy. She was not providing therapy. She was providing a mirror, and the thing looking into the mirror was not broken in the way she had assumed broken looked like. She pulled her chair close to the bay's working surface, close enough that she was within Veth's documented photoreceptor range, and she began talking. Standard, complete sentences. She described what she was observing in the same tone she used for verbal case notes, which was flat and precise, because that was the register she trusted when she did not trust much else. She said, "You have 11 nodes and they are showing a period of 4.3 seconds, and I have set the array to echo your output, and you responded to that, which is data." She said, "I don't know if you can process language or if you have anything I would recognize as experience, and I'm aware that the talking is probably for me more than for you, and I'm doing it anyway." Veth's nodes pulsed. The array echoed them. Sabin kept talking. The embassy observer. She had noticed the feed indicator in the upper right corner of the bay's monitoring panel, the Scifi sigil that indicated an active remote connection, green and steady, had been on the line for 6 hours. She did not acknowledge it. She did not modify her behavior for it. She was doing what she was doing regardless of observation, and she knew this about herself, and also knew that humans generally believed this about themselves and were frequently wrong, and she did not know which case this was. Veth extended a chromatophore filament, 3.4 centimeters, measured later from the bay footage. It reached toward the photostimulation node that Sabin's left hand was resting near, adjusting the array's angle. Sabin did not move her hand. She kept talking. The removal order came in at 6:12 station time, which was early enough that Sabin had not slept. She had the alert set for anything from the embassy, and the alert woke her from the chair where she had been sitting, still in the bay, 4 meters from Veth's enclosure. Compact Treaty Annex 7, Subsection 3. Biological material with no registered custodian and no legal status under any compact signatory framework could be classified as waste and removed by the originating species representatives upon request. The embassy had filed the request at 600. Pickup was scheduled in 4 hours. She had 4 hours. She pulled the compact legal database and started reading. This was the kind of reading that felt like action and mostly was not, and she knew that, and she did it because the alternative, sitting with the knowledge of the removal order and not doing anything with her hands, was not something she was capable of. The relevant question was whether Veth's medical status had changed sufficiently since the biological severance filing to constitute grounds for contest. At the time of the severance filing, Veth's coherence index had been 0.17. Sabin ran a fresh scan. 0.28, not healthy range, rising. She pulled every xenobiological preservation statute in the compact framework and ran them against the new reading and against Veth's documented responsiveness to the photostimulation protocol. The argument was, the organism had demonstrated neurological development in a supervised medical context. The biological severance classification had been applied to an organism in a state of metabolic distress without medical evaluation. That classification should be stayed pending formal review. The argument was technically valid. The legal review algorithm told her so. It also told her that a formal stay required a co-signature from a licensed compact xenobiologist as a check against medics reclassifying waste material as patients to avoid disposal protocols. This was a reasonable safeguard. It was also, at this moment, a wall. The station's xenobiologist was Dr. Echterberg. Dr. Echterberg was on rotation leave on Ganymede and was not reachable through official channels until 1400 station time, which was 90 minutes after the removal order was scheduled to execute. Sabin had Echterberg's personal comm code because they had worked 2 contamination events together and had exchanged codes in the way that people who do difficult things in proximity to each other sometimes do. She called voicemail. She called again, voicemail. She left a message. The message was longer than she intended. It contained, at some point in its middle section, the phrase she's changing in a vocal register that her auditory processing, listening to herself, classified as distress. She heard herself say it and did not re-record the message. She sent it. Then she sat and looked at Veth's scan and the number 0.28 and thought about what she was actually doing here, the real substrate of it underneath the legal scaffolding. She was trying to prevent the removal of an organism that had no legal status, no kin, no claim on any framework that the compact had built, and she was doing this because the organism had extended a chromatophore filament 3.4 centimeters toward her hand and had shown a measurable period in its neural emissions and had shifted frequency when the array echoed it back. This was not, she told herself, irrational. There was data. The data suggested development. The data warranted investigation. This was true. The argument was also being generated by the same cortex that had watched her open the pod before she had a reason to, and she was aware of this relationship, and she filed the legal paperwork anyway, because the alternative was letting the embassy take Veth in 2 hours and 40 minutes, and she was not going to do that. With 22 minutes remaining, the comm lit up. Echterberg's face appeared on the screen, sleep disarranged, clearly in a different time zone's early morning, visibly irritated. He said, "This had better be a genuine emergency, Sabin." She said, "I need your co-signature on a xenobiological stay of removal, and I need it in 20 minutes. He said, "What?" She talked, he listened. The irritation shifted gradually into something else. Not warmth. Achterberg did not do warmth on short notice, but attention. Real attention, the kind that meant the case had caught in something. He asked questions. She answered them. He asked about the period. She pulled up the graph she had saved on day 2 and shared her screen. The line stayed open. The stay was granted at 9:48 station time. Provisional, 90 days. The compact tribunal logged the Scari embassy's protest and scheduled a formal hearing for 43 days out. Veth remained in the bay. Sabin went back to work. This was the part she did not have a framework for, which was most of it. The legal filing gave her 90 days and a hearing date, and no guidance on what to do in the interval with an organism whose neurology was doing something the existing literature could not classify. She ran daily scans. She maintained the Equerry protocol. She kept talking, in the same flat, precise register, about what she was observing, partly because it produced case notes, and partly because she had started and stopping felt wrong in a way she did not examine. Veth's coherence index at the time of the legal stay, 0.31. 11 nodes plus 1 partial reactivation in the 12th position, intermittent, not stable, rising. Sabin filed the paperwork to be listed as Veth's provisional medical custodian. The form had a field for relationship to subject. She typed none. She looked at it. She deleted it and typed medical responsibility. She looked at that. She deleted it and typed custodian and submitted the form without looking at the field again. She did not know what she was to Veth. She was not certain Veth had a concept that mapped onto what she was doing. The Scari literature on solitary juveniles was, as she had noted, absent, not sparse, absent, because the category had not existed long enough for literature to accumulate around it. Veth was not a research subject in any database. She was a reading that did not fit the instrument. The embassy observer's report, she learned later, not at the time, not until the tribunal proceeding, when it was entered as evidence, ran to 31 pages. The executive summary had been written by the Scari Science Directorate's Xenobehavioral Division, which was the closest Scari equivalent to what humans would call a department of minds. It described, in the precise translated flatness of Scari technical writing, what the observer had watched across 72 hours of bay footage. It noted the pod opening without authorization. It noted the continued resource expenditure after the utility assessment had returned negative. It noted the talking. It noted the hand that did not move. It noted that the human had extended social recognition to an organism her own species had no framework to classify, and that the Scari had legally voided, and had done this without kin bond, without rational utility calculus, without apparent expectation of reciprocity or resource return. The final line of the executive summary read, "We do not have a model for this. We are requesting a dedicated research allocation." The tribunal, reading this document, granted the stay permanent pending a full xenobiological review of Veth's status. Sabin was in the bay when the notification came through. She read it. She set the tablet down. She looked at Veth, who had 17 active nodes now, whose arrhythmic period had settled to 3.9 seconds, consistent, the 12th node blinking in its partial way, not healthy, not what the database called coherent, but present and doing something she did not have a word for yet. She felt something that she identified with her usual unreliability as hope. Whether hope was a thing that existed in the prefrontal cortex or was a story the brain generated after the motor system had already decided to keep moving, she did not know. She had read enough neuroscience to know the question was live and to be suspicious of her own answer. She kept moving. Veth's chromatophores shifted. Not the distress frequency she had logged on day 1. Not the cluster echo frequency the database documented as social. Something else. A color the Scari database had no entry for, which meant either the database was incomplete or Veth was producing something that had not been produced before, and Sabin photographed it because it was data, and data was what you saved when you did not know yet what you were looking at. She labeled the file. She typed, "Baseline Day 3." She saved it to Veth's medical record, which now had a custodian listed and a legal status and a 43-day-old hearing that had resolved in her favor. She did not know what she was the baseline of. She saved it anyway.